The CSS box model lies at the heart of web page layout, but it doesn't always work how you might expect. So in this lesson, I want to try a practical experiment to help you understand the rules of the box model. Don't worry if you find this difficult to grasp on the first viewing. It's not difficult, but the box model has some unexpected quirks that you need to be aware of when building web pages. In the exercises site, I've created this file box_model.html. And you can find a copy of the file in the basic page layout folder of the course assets. At the moment, the page contains a single div with the ID box1. If you look in the CSS designer in the selectors pane, I've already created a style rule for both box1 and box2, and they're both going to have the same width and height, 300 pixels wide, 150 pixels high. We'll add box2 later. First I want to add some padding to this div. Padding goes inside an element and adds vertical and horizontal space, but I also want to check what effect this has on the dimensions of the element. So to be able to do that measurement, I need to turn on the rulers in Dreamweaver. So go to the View menu, Rulers Show. There's a keyboard shortcut on Windows, Ctrl-Alt-R. The keyboard shortcut on a Mac is Command-Option-R. And this turns on horizontal and vertical rulers measured in pixels. If you drag from one of the rulers with your mouse, you can drag guidelines and snap one to the right-hand side of the div and another to the left. Then from the horizontal ruler at the top, drag down another guideline to the bottom and one to the top. And to measure the dimensions, put the cursor over the div itself, and then on Windows hold down the Control key, on a Mac hold down the Command key, and you should see the dimensions. They're confirmed as being 300 pixels wide and 150 pixels high. So let's get to work on box 1. Select box 1 in the selectors pane, and then we need to deselect Show Set. And what I want to do is to add padding, so that's in the layout section. Scroll down to the padding visual tool, click the chain icon in the center so that all the values are the same, and set the padding to 20 pixels. And as soon as you do so, you can see that the div spills out of those guides. So if you drag the guides so that they're against the right and bottom edges again, and then remeasure the dimensions, you can see that it's now 340 pixels wide and 190 pixels high. So in other words, the 20 pixels all around of padding have been added to the width and the height. Let's add a border. Click the border icon in the properties pane. Set the border color. It doesn't matter what you set it to. I'm just going to choose red. Then border width, set that to 15 pixels, and the width again, and the border isn't actually displayed until you set border style, so set that to solid. Once you do that, you can see that we're spilling out of those guides again. Move them and measure the dimensions again. We're now 370 pixels wide and 220 pixels high. So both the border and the padding have been added outside the declared width of this box. If I go back to the group selector, box 1, box 2, and then right up to the top, you can see that the width and the height have not changed. So the width and the height refer only to the content, they don't include the padding or the border. Let's reselect box 1 and this time add some margin. Click the chain icon in the center to set all to the same value and set the margin to 20 pixels. And you can see that we've moved away from the top and left guides. There's 20 pixels margin there, 20 pixels margin there, and the background color of the element doesn't move into the margin. If you're wondering why the top and left guides are not right at the very edge of the page, that's because browsers add an 8-pixel margin by default around every page. So if you want to get rid of that 8-pixel margin, you need to set the margin to 0 on the body element. So I want to add a second box to this page, so I'm going to go to Insert, then Div. I don't want it the insertion point, I want it after tag, after box 1. I've already created a style rule for box 2, so I can select the ID in that field there and then just click OK. And I've given box 2 exactly the same amount of padding, border and margin. I've also floated both of these boxes so they're next to each other. If you're not sure what floating is, I'll be dealing with that in a separate lesson. What I want to do is to measure the distance between these two divs. So move those guides, one to the left of box 2 and one to the right of box 1. Put the cursor between them and hold down the Control or the Command key, and you can see that the distance between them is 40 pixels. That's probably exactly what you expected, because there are 20 pixels of margin on the right hand side of box 1 and 20 pixels of margin on the left hand side of box 2. But now I'm going to select the style rule for box 1 and box 2, and I'm going to go down to float and I'm going to set it to none. And what this does is the two items are now stacked on top of each other. And what I'd like to do this time is to measure the distance between the two. So let's move those guides, and you can probably see visually, without even having to measure, that the distance between these two is considerably less than the distance that was between these two guides. Let's just measure it. It's 20 pixels, and the reason for this is that when you get two vertical margins that are adjacent, they collapse, they merge. So instead of 20 plus 20 equaling 40, when they are vertical adjacent margins, they merge to the size of the larger of the two. In this case, they're both exactly the same, so we get a 20 pixel margin between the two. If I select box 1 and deselect this chain icon in the center and increase the bottom margin, say to 40 pixels, there is now a 40 pixel margin between the two. So this is one of the confusing quirks that I've mentioned about the box model. When you've got adjacent vertical margins, they merge, but when you've got adjacent horizontal margins, they don't merge. So to recap, in the traditional CSS box model, width and height refer only to an element's content. If you add padding to an element, it goes outside the content and adds to the overall dimensions. The element's background stretches into the padding. If a border is present, it goes outside the padding, adding further to the overall size. Margins go outside everything else and do not inherit the element's background. Now, as I say, that's the traditional CSS box model. There is actually a slightly different version of the box model, so let's go back to Dreamweaver to see how that works. I've got box 1 selected, and in the Properties pane, just above margin is box sizing, and if I open that and set it to border box, you don't notice any difference in design view, but as soon as I turn on live view you should see an immediate difference. And what has happened here is that the padding and the border have been included in the overall width. So the overall width of this box is now 300 pixels, its overall height is 150 pixels. In other words, it's exactly the same as in the declared width and height in the style rule. So why did I go through all the explanation of the traditional CSS box model when you can do it like this, which seems to be so much simpler, and certainly it is a lot simpler. The reason is because the traditional box model is the way that websites have been made for a very long time, and you will certainly come across the traditional box model in a lot of websites. The other reason is that the box sizing isn't supported by Internet Explorer 6 or 7. So if you need to support older browsers, you still have to go with the older box model. So this again is the traditional CSS box model. But if you use the box sizing property and set its value to border box, width and height are calculated differently. The elements padding and border, if any, are included in the width and height. Although this makes calculations easier, it doesn't work in older versions of Internet Explorer, so I won't be using box sizing in the rest of this course, but feel free to do so yourself if you don't need to support older browsers. Whichever method you use of calculating width and height, the rules affecting collapsing are the same. Padding and borders never collapse. Horizontal margins never overlap, but when vertical margins are adjacent to each other, they collapse to the size of the largest one.